We took it all. We brought them to our land. An endless night, ember hot and icy cold. The rage of the earth. We made this curse. Carved it in the blood on our backs. We did not see. We could not, but she did. And in the end...
What will I become?
Senua's Saga. Hellblade 2.
Play it now with Game Pass.
On a rainy night, if you wear red, you'll die. The bus came to a stop in the rural outskirts of Hwaseong, and a woman stepped off, clutching her umbrella as the rain poured down. She started to walk home along the country road, with only the sound of raindrops and buzzing cicadas around her. Rice fields stretched out on either side of the road into the deepening darkness. She heard something, a faint sound coming from the rice field, like a shuffling. Her pulse quickened, but she dared not look back. Footsteps. The sound was footsteps, matching her pace. She glanced over her shoulder to see a large figure wrap an arm around her neck and drag her into the wet, muddy rice field. Night turned into day, the rain still beating down, washing away what evidence was left behind as the figure emerged from the field and waved the approaching bus down. Welcome to Korean True Crime, with me, your host, Mimi Mizuko. Thank you to Vix Mac, Lala, William White, G1 Edwards, Nico, Elijah Hancock, Anomanom, Dr. Bob, My96, Lumos, Emma Brown, David Tafoya, Adriana, Dade512, Lisa, and Shebecca for your support on Patreon. We now have a sticker bonus tier and a hoodie bonus tier. Currently, the Korean True Crime logo sticker is available, but will be put in the vault as new stickers become available. Become a patron for 3 months to earn a reward. Thank you to my amazing patrons for making this show possible. We now also have a Discord where we host movie nights. Find the link in the description. Warning: today's episode contains discussion of multiple sexual assaults. Listener discretion is advised. We are finally covering the entirety of the Hwaseong serial killer case, also known as the Chun-jae case. This is a now solved case but remained cold for over 30 years. All of the mystery, suffering, and darkness because of one man. Chun-jae was always perceived as an entirely average individual. When you hear about someone as monstrous as him, you might expect that he was a bully, an outcast, or displayed signs that he would turn out this way. But that wasn't the case. Born on January 31st, 1963, in Hwaseong, which is a city located in Gyeonggi Province, he grew up in Taean, a small rural area surrounded by rice farms. Presently, this region is commonly known as Byeongjam, which translates to Rice Cake Street. In the past, this beloved area was also known as Dokjeonggori. Dok refers to a rice cake, jeon is a savory Korean pancake, and gori translates to an intersection or boulevard. Through the Chinese writing system, the term was pronounced as Byeongjam. Despite gaining popularity for its cuisine, the town had a population of fewer than 30,000 residents due to how spread out it was. The rice fields played a significant role in Chun-jae's upbringing, as his parents and grandparents owned a rice farm. When he was young, he was well-behaved, caused no trouble, and showed obedience, particularly towards his father. So everyone saw Chun-jae as a quiet child with a meek personality. It's cliché to say nobody ever suspected he would become such a monster, but it's true. A classmate of his would say, he was a good friend, but he was like a ghost. He didn't even know the sound of his own voice. He had a younger brother whom he got along well with, and his mother said that he was as polite as could be. But that politeness would stem from what Chun-jae would recall as an incredibly strict upbringing. His father was extremely patriarchal and a man who believed that hard work was the only way to be a real man. This militant-like structure forced his children to behave and have manners, but to the detriment of their well-being. Growing up being treated as a soldier rather than a child impacted his view of the world around him. He found it difficult to express himself or show his real emotions to others. This made it difficult for him to cope with grief when his younger brother suddenly passed away in elementary school. His brother accidentally drowned when swimming unsupervised. He recalls being close to his brother and felt very protective of him. He says that he never would feel the same way again. With no one to speak to about his pain, it became a poison inside of him. His father's controlling behavior began to worsen after his brother's passing. Afraid of losing another son, Chun-jae lost all the remaining freedoms he had left. As he became a teenager struggling to gain control over his own life against a strict father, he started to feel an uncontrollable hot rage build up inside of him, an anger that he couldn't control. He's suffering from grief, frustration, and then something happens to make him snap. Chun-jae can't recall if he told his parents or not about what happened to him, but he knew that if he did, that they would have said it didn't matter or that he was lying. When he was in middle school, an older woman approached him on his walk home. She invited him inside of her home, coercing him and grooming him to come inside. With deep trauma recalling the incident, he spares details of what happened next, but while inside her house, the older woman sexually assaulted him. He knew that his father wouldn't care, stating that women couldn't assault men, an unfortunate belief that has persisted even to this day, a belief that harms men who are victims. While sex crime statistics are dominated by men, about 3 to 4% of sexual offenders are women. While still rare, it should be taken seriously. Children should be believed. Victims should be believed. I should preface this by saying that the statistics is for female sex offenders, not pedophiles. Police believe that most women pedophiles are not caught and most likely do not engage in the creation of pornography, but rather in sexual situations with preteen to teenage boys. This is still grooming, and this is still sexual assault. Because Chun-jae received no support or therapy after his traumatic event, it's likely that it shaped his distorted sexual desires later in life. However, to the rest of the world, he stayed that shy boy until he graduated from technical high school in 1983 at the age of 20. He struggled in the later years of high school and ended up needing to graduate late, but he still received his diploma. Because he didn't do that well in high school and without hopes to attend college, his only choices were to find work or to complete his mandatory military service. So at the age of 20, he entered the military. And those who knew him in the military would have a completely different view of what Chun-jae was like. His peers said that this was clearly his calling. He was in his element. Quickly after joining the military, he was chosen to become a tank driver who led the rest of the tanks and infantry in drills. He had a sense of belonging and accomplishment. He felt praise and was rewarded for doing well. He was also given the structure he was accustomed to being raised under his father's iron fist. When asked about his military service, this is the only time he'd ever show emotion in his face during police interrogations. He remembered his time in the military as one of the only times he ever felt happy. Perhaps it's because he was able to channel his anger and rage into his duties, and his lack of emotion wasn't a downfall. He enjoyed his time so much that he opted to forego his vacation time to stay on the base and learn more. It's surprising that his mandatory service ended, that he didn't try to stay in the military. It may be likely that the military saw the anger inside of him and chose not to allow him to continue, but he was discharged in January of 1986 after completing his 3-year service. Immediately following his discharge from the military, he got a job working at an electrical parts company in Hwaseong. He didn't have close friends and kept to himself at work. When he left work, that is when Chun-jae's true self was able to come out. In the following months, a string of indiscriminate sexual assaults were plaguing the area. There was no apparent MO or discernible pattern for the crimes. Chun-jae was sexually assaulting women whenever the opportunity to overpower them arose. Chun-jae was already a monster, even before he started to kill, and his lust for violence would only become more cruel as time went on. By September of that year, Chun-jae was escalating his assaults, and they were becoming more violent. Some of the women were beaten during their assaults, and some were stabbed. And where were the police? This was the time of the Gimpo International Airport's bombing, before the start of the 1986 Asian Games hosted in Seoul. Police activity was ramped up in Seoul during this time, so Lee Chun-jae took advantage of their redirected attention. Most of the police in the Gyeonggi-do area, which surrounds Seoul in a circle, were called into Seoul following the bombing to act as security for the Asian Games. To understand Lee Chun-jae's mind, we must understand that there are multiple profiles for rapists. According to Crisis Center, the most common types of rapists are power rapists and anger rapists. A power rapist is also known as a gentleman rapist or a date rapist. They are insecure and have feelings of inadequacy. They may also feel entitled to a woman or feel challenged by women. They assault women in an effort to gain control and power. Anger rapists have two subcategories: retaliatory and excitation. In retaliation, they want to punish one specific victim. They may use a weapon and tell the victim that it is their fault. The assault is generally unplanned and short. The excitation rapist or sadistic rapist gets sexual gratification from the victim's suffering. The more aggressive they are, the more powerful they feel, and the more excited they become. In reality, many victims do not survive attacks from sadistic rapists. Lee Chun-jae would be categorized as a sadistic rapist. In the Hwaseong area, Lee Chun-jae saw an elderly woman returning to her daughter's home in the late hours of the night on September 14, 1986. The woman's name was Lee Hwa-nim, a 71-year-old woman who lived in the countryside working as a farmer. After working on her crops and preparing them for sale at a market in Suwon, she returned home late that night by bus. She was carrying her unsold produce in her bag. Despite being 71 years old, she worked all through the busy fall season, tending to her farm and selling her produce. However, she never made it back home that night. Lee Chun-jae was waiting in the dark, looking for another victim to sexually assault. Shortly after 9 p.m., he grabbed her as she walked past the rice fields, pulling her into the waist-high plants. He would say that he didn't intend to murder her that day, but with how his violence was escalating, he didn't seem displeased with what came next. 5 days later, on September 19th, at around 2 p.m., the farm owner discovered Lee Hwa-nim's body. She was found less than 10 minutes from her daughter's home. Her body was laying on her back with her legs crossed into an X. Her pants and underwear had been removed during the assault. Her purse and vegetables were found scattered around her body. The farmer called the police, and 3 officers were dispatched to the scene. No detectives were available in the area. The officers who did respond searched the area for evidence before sending her body in for an autopsy. Forensic procedures during this time weren't very advanced, so the most that was collected were her discarded socks and rubber shoes from the field. She'd only had a few coins left behind. The rest of her money was taken. No fingerprints, footprints, or other evidence was collected from the crime scene. However, they did photograph a cigarette butt that was nearby her body, but no DNA was attempted to be taken from it. From her autopsy, the cause of death was strangulation, but there were no traces of semen in the vaginal swab sample. The police concluded that this must mean that this was a molestation and not a rape based off the evidence. The only difference is that there was no penetration. The culprit was most likely looking to rob the woman. DNA evidence was only used in high-profile cases, and even then it was unreliable. What we know about DNA evidence wouldn't come to international forensic procedures until years to come. Although detectives reflecting on this case wish that more effort had been put into this initial murder that could have caught Lee Chun-jae much sooner. But no one could have predicted the years of terror that would ensue. Uncertain if he would be caught, he shut himself in. Both the paranoia of being caught and the rush from his first murder, he wouldn't go out in public for a month. The only thing that came from Lee Hwa-nim's death was a newspaper article mentioning her passing. There wasn't even a public investigation. Lee Chun-jae had been sexually assaulting women without breaks for 10 months. This abrupt halt in his activities left him feeling frustrated and restless, so on October 20th, 1986, he returned to stalk the dark streets of Hwaseong, looking for another victim. He found Park Hyun-suk, a 25-year-old woman who was walking home from the bus stop. Earlier that day, Hyun-suk got a call from her foster mother asking her to come over for dinner. Her mother had found a potential partner for her and would introduce him at dinner. Hyun-suk was excited to meet him and chose her favorite skirt to wear. She rode the bus to her mother's home in Taean neighborhood. Although she got off on the right stop, her mother's house was still a short walk away. With the clouds darkening overhead, she worried about it beginning to rain and quickened her pace. She arrived to her mother's house on time. Her mother thought that they were a lovely couple and felt hopeful for their future together. Park Hyun-suk was able to spend some time alone with the man until around 8:50 p.m. when she said goodbye to her mother and her date. By this time, it was already dark outside, and with Hwaseong being such a rural area, the yellow street lamps barely illuminated the dirt roads. As she walked, a rustle in the fields behind her startled her. Then suddenly, a man lunged out and grabbed her from behind. No one even heard a scream as she disappeared into the fields. 3 days later, on October 23rd, while attending to his rice fields, the farm owner spotted an object lodged in the concrete waterway on his farm's perimeter. He peered inside and saw a woman's bare feet. When he shined a light inside, he saw a woman's dead body shoved into the drainage tube. He called the police, who came out to the scene to find Park Hyun-suk's body. Her body was on its back with her knees bent to the side. Her arms were tied behind her back, and she had several stab wounds to the chest and her back that appeared to have been made with a small tool like a screwdriver or a pocket knife. Around her neck was her own pair of stockings that Chun-jae had taken off of her during the attack, wrapped around her neck and strangled her to death with. They were tied tightly with a knot. There was still dried tear stains on her face when they found her. Her clothes were found thrown on the embankment at the side of the road alongside a milk carton, cigarette butt, and some strands of hair, all believed to have belonged to the killer. The investigating police did not make any connections between the first victim, Lee-Nim's death, and Park Hyun-suk's death, but there was more forensic evidence collected in this case. When her body was brought in for an autopsy, they confirmed that she had been sexually assaulted, and her vaginal fluid swab came back positive for traces of semen. DNA testing done on the semen failed to return a blood type analysis. However, the cigarette butt, milk carton, and some of the hair strands found at the scene were tested, and they all came back positive, and they all returned back to be blood type B. The police interrogated men in the area and focused on a local man who often called Park Hyun-suk pretty when he saw her. When interrogated, he also told the police how pretty she was and how sad it was for such a beautiful woman to die. But beyond his affinity for Park Hyun-suk, there was no evidence connecting him to the crime. They continued to question people in the area and anyone who had visited, but they had no prime suspects to question, and ultimately the case went cold. Both of these murders took place between Chun-jae's home and his workplace. He was attacking women in the area he was very familiar with. The investigation into Park Hyun-suk's murder hadn't even concluded by the time Chun-jae decided to strike again. This time, he wouldn't wait a month. His fantasies were getting stronger, and he wasn't able to resist killing again. He wanted to chase that high. 10 days after he murdered Park Hyun-suk, he returned to the streets to find another victim. I want to preface this next victim's story that this assault was not included in the trial of Chun-jae. However, it was revealed in an interview with Detective Hwaseong, who was the lead detective in charge of this investigation, in an interview in 2020. The victim's name is anonymous due to witness protection, but we can refer to her as her surname, Kim. Following a church service, 45-year-old Kim began her walk home at 9 p.m. She lived less than 400 meters from the church, which is only a few blocks. The walk home is safe in such a rural location, except for the occasional wild animal. As she walked along the rice fields in the cool air, she heard someone walking behind her. Their footsteps seemed to almost match hers. But as the sound quickened, so did her heartbeat. A cold sweat came over her, and she turned to see who was quickly approaching her. A man's arm wrapped around her neck, and a sharp weapon that she assumed to be a knife was placed against her side. She couldn't scream through the arm covering her mouth as the man dragged her backwards into the rice field. Kim recalled being too frightened to resist. The darkness made it difficult to ascertain what direction she was even facing. In her panic, she felt betrayed by her own feet that wouldn't listen to her or kick or do anything to get away. She was in a total state of shock. The man brandished the weapon, threw her to the ground, and ripped off her stockings. He began to tie her arms behind her back, threatening her if she moved. Kim was wearing a girdle under her dress, and Chun-jae forced it off of her and placed it over her head, covering her eyes. He took her underwear and shoved them in her mouth to prevent her from screaming. He began to sexually assault her, and in the panic, Kim focused on trying to see her assailant. She moved her head, trying to see through the leg hole of the girdle, but a rural farm is a very dark place at night. She couldn't see any details of his face or her surroundings, but trying to see him was the only thing she could do, the only thing she could focus on. And as he got off of her, he held the sharp weapon against her skin again and said that if she screamed, she would die. He demanded money from her, but she dropped her purse as he dragged her through the field. He cursed at her and rushed off into the field to find the purse. She knew that this was her only opportunity to escape. She rolled into her side and pushed up onto her knees. She stumbled up and began to run as fast as she could away from her purse, further into the fields. She could hear the echo of a man's string of profanities when he returned to find her missing. She could hear the echo of the man's string of profanities when he returned to find her missing. She didn't know what way the road was, but she knew that if she ran for long enough, she would find help. She can't recall how long she ran for, but when she finally found a house and pounded on the door, the owners answered and she told them to call the police. Thankfully, she had gotten away with her life, but would be plagued by the nightmare forever. Kim told the police that the man was thin and had short hair. He seemed young in his mid-20s and was a bit taller than her. She thought that he was probably 160 to 170 centimeters tall, which is around 5'2 to 5'6. When he cursed, he spoke with a deep voice. She thought he couldn't be a farmer because his hands were unusually soft, and she smelled his sour breath, heavy with alcohol. The police began to interrogate men in the area who matched this description, but it was really vague for an area full of factories where men in their 20s were commonly employed. This attack was even closer to Lee Chun-jae's workplace, less than a 5-minute walk away. But the police presence made Lee Chun-jae nervous enough to return into hiding. He would resume his normal life for 6 weeks before he started looking for another victim. On December 12, 1986, Kwon Jung-bun, a 25-year-old woman, finished her shift at a factory job. At around 6 p.m., she left the factory to get on a bus headed towards Suwon to meet her husband where he worked. The young couple ate dinner together at a restaurant and stayed together until around 10:30 p.m. when Kyung Jung-bun wanted to go home. Her husband stayed in the area because of work, so he walked her to the bus stop to say goodbye. She said goodbye to her husband and got on the bus to return home. The ride took about 30 minutes, and she got off at 11 p.m. near a three-way intersection. The bus stop was only a few blocks from her home, but in that short distance, she would disappear. Kwon Jung-bun walked towards her home, but was attacked from behind in the same manner as Kim. No one in the area heard any screams as she too disappeared into the rice fields. Lee Chun-jae was now going out with the intention to murder his victims. Just as he did before, he removed her underwear and stockings, bound her arms behind her back, and gagged her. He placed her shapewear over her eyes and assaulted her, then killed her by strangling her with her own stockings, tying them in a tight knot. Lee Chun-jae didn't just leave the bodies behind. He moved them slightly, somewhere that would be more difficult to find, but he never put much effort into hiding them permanently. In a way, he wanted the bodies to be found, but after enough time had passed that he felt safe. He moved her body to the embankment near an office building that had construction materials piling up on the outskirts. Her body was inside the sack of a sandbag that was in a pile of other bags. Through the cold winter months, no one discovered her body, laying within sight of her own home's windows. She was less than 50 meters from her own front door. When her husband came home, he would unknowingly pass his wife's body for months. When the farmer who owned this rice field walked to the edge of his property, repairing the raised ridges of the paddy field, he noticed one of the wet sandbags appeared to have something large inside of it. He could have just dismissed this as misshapen sand that was wet and frozen, but he approached the sandbag and found Kwon Jung-bun's body on April 23, 1987, 4 months after she was murdered. Her body was found with her underwear draped over her face, bloody and torn. Her body had extensively decayed and couldn't be identified until they discovered in her belongings a name stamp called a dojang, which had her name engraved in it. These name stamps are often used to sign legal documents, although are less common now. When her body was brought in, it had unfortunately undergone too much decay that an autopsy to obtain evidence was impossible. Before Kwon Jung-bun's body was discovered, just 2 days after her murder, Lee Chun-jae returned again. but to a new neighborhood in Hwaseong. On December 14, 1986, Lee Jae-suk, a 22-year-old woman, was out meeting a friend for coffee after work in the downtown area of Suwon. The two friends stayed late talking until around 10 p.m. People who knew her said that the man she was meeting was someone that she liked romantically, and he agreed that he also shared her feelings. When they parted ways, she needed to catch the bus before it stopped service for the night. Lee Jae-suk left the cafe and rode the bus home. The bus reached its last stop, which was still more than a kilometer from her house. She had about a 12-minute walk to get home, and it looked like the weather was going to take a turn for the worse. A storm started brewing and rain was pouring down. When Lee Jae-suk didn't come home, her parents and brother began to worry and called the man she had met. He confirmed that he had walked her to the bus and she had gotten on over an hour earlier. A local near the bus stop had even seen her get off the bus, and the bus driver confirmed that she did get off a little bit before 11 p.m. Her parents reported her as missing to the police 2 days later after they tried searching for her themselves. Lee Jae-suk did not live in Taean. She lived a little bit further away, so the police didn't immediately conclude that she may be another victim of the man who had killed 3 women already. She was just a missing person at this point. But just as the others, Chun-jae had attacked Lee Jae-suk from behind and tied her arms behind her back with her red shirt. Her girdle was placed on her head as a blindfold, and her underwear were used as a gag. He had robbed her, but left her purse and umbrella next to her hidden in the grass and leaves. Because of her red 2-piece dress, the news speculated that there was a killer out there targeting women who wore red, because each of the known victims had been wearing something red, although that was most likely just a coincidence, and Chun-jae denied ever noticing what the victims were wearing. Ghost stories were told by children stating that on dark, rainy nights, if you wear red, you'll die. These stories began to become an urban legend, and as time passed, the Hwaseong killer became a monster, much more dangerous than a man. Chun-jae had sexually assaulted Lee Jae-suk just as he had done to countless women, but his violence was escalating. To the unfortunate Lee Jae-suk, his sadistic fantasies were becoming more deranged. During her assault, he had also raped her with her own umbrella. He wanted to not only humiliate his victims, but make them suffer. Lee Jae-suk's body was found by the police, who searched the neighborhood on December 21st, a week later. When her mother saw what had been done to her daughter, she fainted. This was the first case in which the body was autopsied outside of Hwaseong. The police sent her body to be examined by the National Forensic Research Institute due to lack of resources in their small location. The forensic team was able to determine that the semen sample collected from the vaginal swab was also from someone who was blood type B, which began to create a criminal profile for Chun-jae. While this wasn't a lot to go off of, it was a start to a criminal case and meant they could eliminate suspects based off their blood type. The police believed for a long while that Lee Jae-suk was the third murder victim because her body was discovered prior to Kwon Jung-bun's. However, we know now that this wasn't the case. Although the police knew that these murders were connected, they were pressured by the military regime under President Chun-jae to keep the case quiet and not investigate it too publicly. Politically, the government viewed this as a quite sensitive time for their reputation for an international audience, so they didn't want any more attention on the case. Unfortunately, this would mean that the case could not possibly be investigated to proper measures. They weren't canvassing the areas of the city, they weren't widely patrolling yet. Now that the case was even larger than they thought, they had to keep it hush-hush. The police department was being rushed to find the killer quietly, but that was impossible with what they were allowed to do. Without proper measures to stop Chun-jae, the murders would continue, and so would the escalation of his demented fantasies. According to a scientific journal written by Nicola Malizia titled Serial Killer, The Mechanism from Imagination to the Murder Phases, lust serial killers have fantasies about both the sexual violence and murder as a system to defend their own minds against the traumatic reality. Fantasy is a crucial element of the murder in which the killer fantasizes about what they will do, or creates a fantasy in which the victim is involved. By the time the killer has approached the victim, they have performed the assault and killing in their head 1,000,000 times over. A serial killer's behavior is characterized generally in stages. As Malizia states, it is compulsive behavior fueled by impossible desires. First, Chun-jae experienced the motivational phase in which a person's physiological or social needs are not met, sometimes in the form of an obsessive need for attention, positive reinforcement, gratification in their lives, or the desire to possess and control their environment. To right the wrongs of their unmet needs, their mind materializes a fantasy in which they get revenge on others for the wrong that was done to them. If a person resists or shuts down this train of thought, then it's almost guaranteed that they will not pose a danger to others. This is the normal control a person has over dark thoughts when feelings of resentment to the world manifest. Chun-jae had been sexually assaulted by an older woman while walking home. Therefore, he chose to play into his violent, sadistic sexual fantasies of attacking, assaulting, and killing women while they too were walking home. In essence, he was seeking revenge on the wrong that was done to him in a very twisted way. The third phase a serial killer goes through is the mental anticipation of their actions. They build up their aggression and mental angst, which, in their sense, could be considering building up the courage to perform the fantasy. Then, the design phase begins. This phase varies greatly between serial killers, especially pleasure killers. The killer may plan his route, stalk areas, consider the difficulties of their crime, and all of the factors that may prevent them from acting out their fantasy. For many, according to Militia, this is when most people stop, realizing that they'll get caught, or being dissuaded by their thoughts. If they don't stop themselves, then the execution of their fantasy begins. Chun-jae's first murder was an elderly woman whom he didn't plan to kill. He planned to sexually assault her as he had done numerous times, but when it didn't go according to plan, he ended up murdering her without getting the sexual satisfaction he was seeking. Following this, he still entered the satisfaction phase, which is the final stage of the cycle. The killer relishes in the success of their kill and then repeats the cycle, needing to feel that high again, just as an addict might. After realizing he enjoyed the homicidal fantasy and act, he returned to murder again. This time, his cooling off period was a month. Then, Chun-jae would return to Taeyeon, the northwestern part of Hwaseong, to stalk the streets again. He had solidified his MO, or the way in which he kills. The women were tied with their own clothing, usually their stockings and knots. Their face was covered with their girdle, which is now known as shapewear or long underwear, and they were gagged with their underwear, sometimes their socks too. The women were also strangled with their stockings or clothing, which was tied tightly with knots.
We took it all. We brought them to our land. An endless night, ember hot and icy cold. The rage of the earth. We made this curse. Carved it in the blood on our backs. We did not see. We could not, but she did. And in the end,
what will I become?
Senwa Saga. Hellblade 2.
Play it now with Game Pass.
For all of my supportive fans, I know you're always ready for a new episode. If you're like me, you have a few podcasts you'd never miss an episode of. I'd like to recommend a podcast that I actually have been a longtime fan of, Tapes from the Darkside. The in-depth episodes cover every aspect of the case, but what really sets it apart for me is that each episode features real audio from the cases that is both immersive and intense. I first discovered Tapes from the Darkside when they covered the Otto Warmberg case, where an American tourist who visited Pyongyang, North Korea was detained by the North Korean government. I won't spoil any details of the case, but it is an episode you need to hear for yourself. And now, in Tapes from the Darkside's current season, they're deep diving into the case of Chandler Halderson, the 23-year-old who murdered and dismembered his own parents. Let's take a listen.
Bart and Krista Halderson went missing in July of 2021. Their bodies were found dismembered and strewn throughout rural Wisconsin. The last person to see them alive was their son, Chandler, and he quickly became the lead suspect in a criminal case. But what could possibly lead a person to murder their own parents? Come find out on the new season of Tapes from the Darkside, an independent investigative podcast series streaming now on Spotify and all podcast apps.
Listen to Tapes from the Darkside anywhere you find podcasts, or visit their website at tapesfromthedarkside.com. That's tapes with a P, like a cassette tape. Find more information in the description for this episode. On January 10, 1987, Hong Jin-young, a 19-year-old young woman, had gone out to submit her resume for a job and then met a friend in Suwon. She was 2 months away from graduating high school and needed to find a job to support her family. Keep in mind, 19 was her Korean age. She was actually 18 years old internationally in her last year of high school. She was an incredibly bright girl and was often busy with her table tennis team. Her athletic prowess had won her dozens of medals. Jin-young spent that day with her friend before leaving to get on the bus home. She always rode the bus past her stop to a further one, because although this stop seemed farther from her home, it actually was a shortcut. The bus stop close to her house was a 20-minute walk away, but by taking a longer bus route that circled back through the farms, she could shorten her journey by walking along the dirt roads. Getting off the bus at 8:50 p.m., she started her walk through the farms, passing by large stacks of hay. Chun-jae was hiding inside the hay, waiting for her to pass by. When she did, he attacked her and pulled her into the haystack. The next morning, the farmer discovered Hong Jin-young's body with her feet protruding from the hay while he was moving the rice straw. The police arrived at the scene and identified her through an ID found in her bag. They promptly contacted her father, who reached the crime scene in less than 10 minutes because she was attacked so close to her house. The officers couldn't allow him to approach her body because it could contaminate the crime scene, and her body had already been covered to avoid the onlooking of locals. So they showed him her clothing and personal items they found. Her father broke down in tears at the sight and embraced Jin-young's brother. What had been done to Jin-young and the rest of the victims was devastatingly evil. Her hands were tied with her bra, and since Hong Jin-young didn't wear any stockings, she was strangled with her scarf. She was not blindfolded like the others. Initially, the police did not know she was sexually assaulted during the initial visual inspection because she was fully clothed. It wasn't the first conclusion to think that the killer had redressed her, but near the hay piles, they found the torn pieces of her clothing alongside clumps of her body hair, and she was tied using her bra. The collected evidence was sent to the National Forensic Service, who is now assigned to this increasingly desperate investigation. As a result of her autopsy, her vaginal swab came back positive for the presence of semen. However, the sample was tainted with the victim's blood. The results were type B, which matched their previous evidence. However, the victim in this case was also type B, so the sample couldn't be considered conclusive. The police reported this as the fourth murder victim of the Hwaseong killer, since the third victim's body had not yet been found. Her body was discovered 3 months later on April 23rd. They knew that the person they were searching for had to be in the area because all of the known murders took place in a 2-kilometer radius, or 1.3 miles. The Gyeonggi Provincial Police Department deployed a large number of detectives on the case now that it was confirmed they had a serial killer on their hands. They began bringing in suspects, but for the most part, they were only looking at people who knew the victims, but none of the victims were connected in any way. The police were criticized for limiting their suspect pool for no reason. The police department was also operating in very distressing circumstances. Due to heightened fears of communism, North Korean spies, and terrorism, their priorities were not on murders or rapes. I do believe that some of the officers involved cared about finding the killer, but as you'll learn in the next episode, some of them just wanted to close the case as soon as possible, by any means possible. A lot of heat was on this case, and Chun-jae knew that it was becoming more risky to work in his preferred area. He reluctantly went into a longer cooling off period. He now officially fit the definition of a serial killer. He wasn't a spree killer or a mass murderer. Spree killers will kill people over the course of a few days or weeks, and the killings often lack a specific ritual method. According to the American FBI, serial killing is defined by a series of 2 or more murders committed as separate events, usually, but not always, by one offender acting alone. The presence of a cooling off period marks a defining difference. The cooling off period is a break between murders in which a killer either wants to avoid being caught or is satisfied momentarily, and they return to their normal life. They may be content for a short while the police lose their trail or until they find a new victim. The police were desperate to find Chun-jae and finally examined the evidence that they did have. In the first 2 murders, the victims resisted and struggled against their assailant. According to the surviving victim, he attacked suddenly and incapacitated his victims by binding their arms and gagging them. He wanted to have more time and less chance of being caught, but it could also mean he wanted complete power over them. He wanted his victims to be more vulnerable, By analyzing the first 2 murders against the other 3 following, it was determined that the first 2 murders were not intentional. That is, he had intended to harm the women and sexually assault them, but his first victim he murdered before he was even able to sexually assault her, which was his goal. He ran from the crime scene afterwards. The second victim was stabbed repeatedly with a sharp tool, possibly a switchblade or possibly his pocket knife. He had the knife as a way to subdue his victims and force them to listen to his commands, but the stab wounds were on her back and then on her chest. It is likely she tried to turn onto her stomach to crawl or run away, and when he caught her, he stabbed her in the back. Then, she was stabbed again when he was on top of her stomach. He wouldn't repeat this process, most likely because it was not intentional. He had lost his control in that situation. Then following that, his third victim, Kim, survives and escapes. From then on, he binds and gags his victims first, ensuring that he has control over them and that they cannot escape him. Chun-jae had murdered 5 women in the span of 5 months. He would continue at that speed, but the police began to patrol the area and women were refusing to go out at night. Sales of red clothing for women decreased substantially, and it was considered a taboo color for a long time. A similar fear occurred in the United States when women started fearing wearing their hair in ponytails or pigtails because they thought it would make them an easy target to attack from behind. The terrifying truth is that a person who wants to rape and kill will. There is no situation in which what a victim does prevents their rape or murder. Let me preface this by saying women already know how to be safe. If you're a true crime listener, you might even begin to learn how these attackers think and what they might do. This means you can try to avoid dangerous situations, but if the perpetrator wants to hurt someone, they will find or even make the opportunity. Even if someone can prevent their own attack by some way, the perpetrator will find another victim. So it's unhelpful to tell people, had you not worn that or dressed like that, it wouldn't have happened. It's terrifying to think about, but these monsters live amongst us. The motive of these crimes is to gain power, gain control, and dehumanize their victims. Be safe, but know that it is never your fault. With the increased police patrolling in the small area, women should have been safe, but Chun-jae wouldn't be caught. I'd like to reiterate that this is not a very large area. It's mostly farmland, so the actual residential areas are not that big. All of the crimes committed happened within 3 kilometers of the police station. Chun-jae also lived in this area, so he was only killing within walking distance of his own house. And yet, the police still couldn't find him. They were expanding some of the suspect pool to previously convicted sex offenders, but there was no match for the DNA in the database. Chun-jae went into a longer cooling off period than ever before. For 4 months, he went to work at his factory job and just plotted his next move. But on May 2nd, 1987, 29-year-old Park Eun-ju had her dinner and watched TV at home, anticipating her husband's return from work. His job required him to work later than the typical 9 to 6. Normally, his bus arrived around 8:30 p.m., but as 9 p.m. came and passed, she started to feel anxious. The weather was gloomy, with heavy rain and dark skies, and her husband had forgotten his umbrella. She grabbed her umbrella and hooked her husband's on her arm. She walked quickly to the bus stop because the wind was chilling. A neighbor saw her arrive to the bus stop at 9:30 p.m., where she stood waiting for the bus. When the 10 p.m. bus passed without her husband getting off, she decided to go back home, hoping that her husband had taken a taxi instead. She walked home unaware that her husband had been requested to work overtime and had actually caught the 10:30 p.m. bus. He rushed home in the rain without his umbrella, arriving at 11 p.m. to an empty house. He called out to Eun-ju, but there was no answer. His wife was not home. He says that he didn't immediately worry because she might have gone out with friends that evening, and since they didn't have cell phones, it was difficult to communicate sudden changes in their plans. He says that he felt upset in the morning when she still wasn't home, but he couldn't be late for work, so he left to catch the bus. At work, he tried to call her at home, but there was no answer. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, so he called her best friend, who told him that she didn't know where Eun-ju was. He wasn't convinced that she was missing, so he waited until he got home that night to see if she was still gone. He knew he needed to call the police then and reported her missing. Because the Hwaseong killings had happened so close to their neighborhood, the police began to canvass the area, expecting the worst. With all of the previous victims being targeted near rice fields, it was imperative that they send officers out to the nearby farms. However, the police did not find Park Eun-ju. One of the rice farmers had found a pair of outdoor slippers, the kind that you might wear when going out to do an errand or do yard work. They initially believed that someone had discarded trash from the road and thrown it into their field. However, when the police asked to search their field, the farmer was able to guide the police to the section where the shoes had been tossed. The shoes belonged to Park Eun-ju, but her body was not found in the field. Chun-jae had decided to change his body disposal methods to avoid being caught too quickly. This time, he had moved her from the abduction location. A week later, on May 9th, a group of elementary school children walked through a public park on their way to school. Near the top of the hill in the park, next to unmarked burial mounds, was a large pile of pine tree trimmings. The stacks of branches and pine needles was stacked high in a loose pile, but it didn't fully conceal what Chun-jae wanted to hide. The children found Park Eun-ju's body laying on her side, shirtless, with her arms tied behind her back. She was wearing her blue sweatpants, but her blue sweatshirt was discarded with her underwear next to her. Her shirt was used as a blindfold, and her bra was used to bind her arms. Laying next to her were the 2 umbrellas. The police arrived and secured the area. They were able to identify her and contact her husband. When he arrived, he was inconsolable. The immediate grief he must have felt knowing his wife had gone out to meet him in the rain is unfathomable. You imagine yourself in their shoes and it's overwhelming. At this crime scene, there was a piece of evidence left behind that could change the entire case going forward. Multiple, well-preserved footprints going to and from the crime scene near her body were in the wet, loose dirt under the pine needles. These footprints gave full details of the shoes and shoe size of the assailant. However, the DNA evidence found in this case would move them both 1 step closer to finding Chun-jae and 2 steps back. When the vaginal swab results came back, the semen found on the victim was from someone with blood type A. Everything had, up to this point, been blood type B. Blood type B was found at all of the crime scenes. So what could this mean? Did this mean that he had an accomplice? Or that this was a copycat crime? Park Eun-ju's husband was blood type A, so he was the immediate suspect in this case. Had he attacked and murdered his own wife as a copycat killer? After bringing the husband to the police station, he was released shortly after. He wasn't the Hwaseong serial killer, and he didn't kill his wife. The police didn't release what his alibi was, but they removed him from the suspect list. Chun-jae had changed his methods. He hadn't gagged her, and she wasn't abducted near a rice field. Her shoes were found in a rice field far from where she was taken. He had thrown her shoes into the rice field, hoping to play with the police. The police were searching the areas around rice field, knowing that this is where the Hwaseong killer would strike. He was leaving them a message that he wouldn't be caught so easily. When Chun-jae started his spree of sexual assaults after his discharge from the military and then subsequently the murders, it was during the time leading up to the 1986 Asian Games in Seoul. Korea was dealing with their own Red Scare of North Korean spies and the influence of communism, which leading up to the 1986 Games, a North Korean spy detonated a bomb behind a vending machine in the Gimpo International Airport, which killed 5 people just days before the Games started in September, which was 10 days after Chun-jae's first murder. This happened because South Korea won the bid to host the Asian Games over North Korea. People were on edge, but also police were called into Seoul to protect the city from North Korean attacks during the Games because this would be incredibly bad press for South Korea, who was just becoming a developed nation. Chun-jae had taken advantage of this lack of police presence in the smaller area, but 2 years after his first murder, he'd be able to take advantage of another international event. After Park Eun-ju's murder in May 1987, he waited 1.5 years to kill again, this time during the 1988 Seoul Olympics. Because of similar fears of North Korean spies and terrorism, police forces were again called to Seoul to monitor the Olympics. Chun-jae would attack and murder another woman 10 days prior to the Summer Olympics, just as his first murder was 10 days prior to the Asian Games. Whether this was intentional or not is unknown. Also during this time was the June democratic struggle in which military dictator Chun-jae announced President Roh Tae-woo as the next president without a public election, which led to the pro-democracy demonstrations across the nation. To put it into perspective, large political or war news was becoming what was important. People tend to forget or be distracted from smaller things. Lee Chun-jae would not have been able to evade the police for this long had he not done this during a long stretch of the police being focused on terrorism and political demonstrations. He struck again on September 7th, 1988. 54-year-old Ang Ki-sun was working at a bunsikjip, which is a restaurant that can sell things like tteokbokki, fried foods, skewers, gimbap, etc. Bunsik is a food that can be easily prepared and are considered cheap or small meals. It isn't necessarily fast food because typically you stay at the restaurant or food stall to eat it, but it is quick and cheap. Ang Ki-sun worked at the restaurant that was owned by one of her sons. The restaurant was just across the street from the Suwon Theater, making it a very popular late-night spot. She finished up her work at the restaurant and left a little bit after 8:40 p.m. Ang Ki-sun lived quite a bit away, so she took a bus from the Suwon Theater to a small area called Gaje. Gaje is a smaller farming neighborhood in Hwaseong. She needed to walk quite a bit after getting off the city bus. Gaje is also quite far from where all of the other victims were found, so there wasn't as much police presence in this area. This was a half-hour's drive from Daean, the location of most of the murders and where Lee Chun-jae lived. But Lee Chun-jae had chosen a new location with less police presence. Ang Ki-sun's husband waited for his wife to return home, and when it started to get into the later hours of the night, he began to panic. He contacted her parents and started to walk outside looking for her. Everyone in the area knew about the killer who was targeting women walking alone. The entire family gathered to start looking after they contacted the police. But they didn't need to search long before they found her. Ang Ki-sun was found by her cousin-in-law, who found her covered in blood under a nearby cottonwood tree. She was laying on her back, her hands tied with her shirt, and her mouth was gagged with one of her socks and tied with her handkerchief. Her skirt had been put back on her body after the assault. When the police arrived, they brought with them 2 forensic experts from the National Forensic Service and experts from the Public Security Headquarters. They collected all of the evidence that was able to be collected at the scene and sent them in to be tested. During the autopsy, they found that the killer had grown even more disturbed and deranged. It wasn't enough to rape and murder these women, but now he wanted to torture and degrade them. Lee Chun-jae had brought with him a sliced peach, and following the murder, stopped to eat his snack. He then inserted the remaining peach slices inside of Ang Ki-sun's vagina alongside her other sock before violating her with her umbrella. Many people started to refer to Lee Chun-jae as the devil himself. Lee Chun-jae was getting cocky and thought he could evade the police forever. He'd spent over a year in the fantasy stage thinking of even more evil, perverse acts to harm more women. But he'd left behind more footprints, this time leading towards the road. There were 2 men seen in the area that were considered suspects. The first they found out about was a 22-year-old man who was wandering in the area. The police brought him in for questioning, but several witnesses confirmed that he walked through the area and did not stop. The second man seen in the area, who could not be found, had jogged to the main road from the cottonwood tree and hailed the bus going by. The bus driver stopped to let him on, even if the bus stop wasn't nearby. The police were able to contact the bus driver and obtain a statement that led to a police sketch being made. The bus driver said that the man who got on the bus was soaking wet. His pants and shoes were completely wet from the knees down and covered in grass stains. The man was in his late 20s and had a long, slender face. Lee Chun-jae, who was indeed the man on the bus, borrowed a cigarette from the driver, and when he reached to grab the cigarette, that's when the driver noticed that a few of the man's nails appeared to have bongsunga muldirigi, which translates to garden balsam. This was a Korean beauty trend in which women dyed their nails in the summer with this balsam powder, which is similar to henna and dyes your nails a deep orange. They said that if your nails were still dyed by the time winter came, you'd find your true love. So when the driver saw this on his nails, they thought it was unusual because typically men didn't partake in this trend, so it stuck out in his mind. But we know now that wasn't dye on his fingernails. It was blood. Flyers were made with the police sketch on them and the information that they could obtain from witnesses. The sketch was actually very accurate, knowing what Lee Chun-jae looks like now. If you compare the sketch to a picture of him at the time, it's very similar except for his chin. The sketch made his chin a lot more narrow than it was. Alongside his sketch was a picture of a man's haircut that represented what witnesses said his hair looked like. A neat, short haircut that can only be described as a generic man's short haircut. A picture of 2 photoshopped arms were also shown on the flyer wearing a wristwatch with dyed nails because at this point they still believed that he had dyed his pinky and ring fingernail. They also believed he may have a tattoo on his wrist that was hidden by his wristwatch. They believed he was 24 to 27 years old and had an athletic build. He was approximately 165 to 170 centimeters tall, or 5'5 to 5'6". They wrote that he had a thick nose and monolids. His face was also quite slender. The police offered a reward for any information leading to his arrest. Looking back at this flyer, the information is very accurate. They had a detailed profile of what he looked like exactly. It even accurately guessed his age. If they had gone house to house in the Daehan area, they would have caught him either at work or at home. It's an unfortunate situation that the police officers on this case found themselves in. When the case was first established, the government under President Chun-jae had told them to investigate quietly as to not embarrass the nation. But now that the police were receiving heavy criticism from the public for not catching this monster, the government under President Roh Tae-woo turned on them and accused them of dragging their feet. The police department wasn't able to defend themselves in the efforts that they had made, but there was also a lot more they could have done. So they were at fault, but it wasn't entirely their fault. In response, they dispatched a total of 2,050,000 people in the police force and military to investigate a total of 21,000 suspects. This would be the largest force Korea mobilized in its history. Without advanced DNA profiling, which was only new in 1986 in the UK, they didn't have any hope to catch the criminal based off of DNA evidence. As the Olympics began, and with the public trying to raise awareness of the case, the Hwaseong police chief was reprimanded and forced to step down from his position. In the next episode, you'll learn about the various suspects they found and interrogated in efforts to quickly solve the case. Just 9 days after Lee Chun-jae murdered An Ki-seun, another body would be found. A mother woke up on September 16, 1988 at 6:50 a.m. and began her daily routine, which included waking up her 13-year-old daughter, Park Sang-hee. Her daughter usually woke up on her own, but as a caring mother, she always made sure to check on her and say good morning. But her daughter wasn't awake this morning and the alarm continued to go off. She turned on her daughter's bedroom lights and flung off her blanket to find her daughter dead. When the police arrived, during the initial assessment, they noticed a clear handprint bruise on her neck and dried tear stains on her cheeks. Someone had climbed into the ground floor window and raped the 13-year-old Park Sang-hee and strangled her to death. There is almost no similarities between this case and Lee Chun-jae's usual methods, but they couldn't rule out the possibility that the Hwaseong killer was changing his methods to not be caught. Evidence was meticulously collected at this scene, now that the public's eye was on the case and appropriate staffing was provided. Hair from the criminal's head and pubic hair were present at the scene as well as shoe prints. These shoe prints were reportedly much smaller than that of the ones they had collected at 2 other crime scenes. The body hair was collected and sent to a forensics lab in Japan that had more advanced forensic techniques. As a result of the analysis, the lab found that the hair samples contained about 300 times higher levels of titanium than the average person is exposed to. This was narrowing down who they would look for. This was someone who worked with a large amount of metal processing. Officers were sent to investigate 32 nearby factories and repair centers. They collected hair samples from all of the 1,500 men they interviewed. It took a long while to return the samples, but they were able to find the assailant in July of 1989. 22-year-old Yoon Sung-yeol, who worked at a nearby agricultural equipment repair center. His body hair came back positive for the same levels of titanium found on the hairs of the crime scene with a close match. The sample was tested against the hairs and semen found at the other victims' crime scenes, but it was not a match. The police concluded that this was a copycat crime, although the rape and murder did not match the methods used in Lee Chun-jae's crimes. The 5 officers who found and arrested Yoon Sung-yeol were promoted for their ability to find the real culprit. He confessed to his crimes, was found guilty in court, and sentenced to life imprisonment. The police said that Yoon Sung-yeol was a stalker. He had his eye on Park Sang-hee's older sister, who was in high school. He knew her because he had been classmates with their older brother. When he climbed in through the window, he thought he was in the older sister's room, hoping to assault her that night. But when he went into the wrong room, he decided to continue his plans anyways. But when she began to make noise that might get him caught, he strangled her to death. The police ruled him out as a suspect for the rest of the cases, but it's important to this case because without the public's criticism towards the police, Yoon Sang-yeol would have never been arrested if not for the pressure for the police to close the case quickly. Lee Chun-jae's string of murders was almost ended forever on September 26, 1989. He broke into a house at 12:55 in the late hours of the night looking for another victim. Lee Chun-jae was known for his excessive drinking when he went out at night, and police believe he was intoxicated during many of the murders as well. When he followed his MO, he made less mistakes. But now that he was trying something new, he got sloppy. Lee Chun-jae was caught while breaking into a building, wearing gloves and holding a knife. The police arrested him and his case went to trial. He was in police custody for days, with them not knowing that they had already caught the Hwaseong serial killer. They even had a police sketch of him with descriptions that he matched very closely. They'd even had his fingerprints from previous crime scenes, but none of this would lead to their discovery of his connection to the murders. He thought they were going to catch him though. At his first trial, he told the judge that he wasn't breaking into the house to commit a robbery, which is what he was arrested for. He spun a tale saying that he was walking home, he was attacked by a man in the dark, the man hit him and started to chase him down. In self-defense, he took out his pocket knife and ran into the house to find safety. But his story was unbelievable, and he was sentenced to 1 year and 6 months in prison and to serve 2 years of probation. He was released in April of 1990, only for the terror of the Hwaseong serial killer to restart again. Tune in again in 2 weeks to listen to part 2 of Lee Chun-jae's story. It's only halfway done and only gets more intense from here. Learn about his final victims and the victims that were tortured in efforts to stop the Hwaseong serial killer. Thank you for listening to Korean True Crime. I hope that you enjoyed today's episode. If you'd like to vote on future episode topics, join Korean True Crime on Patreon today. If you'd like to hear more, follow the show wherever you listen and be sure to leave a review. Don't forget to join our Discord today. 다음에 또 봐요. See you next time.